Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And as if those of you who know me know that part of the richness of teaching for me is what I learn in the process. Um, my Zen training goes back so many decades. And for whatever reason, I kind of woke up. I won't say it was January 1st, but maybe January 2nd this year, and just felt this urge to go back and go through a lot of writing that I've done, asking myself, what have I actually learned in the process of my 50 plus years of training? One answer is not much. So that's always a reminder as I pull these things together. But there's also just a sort of a fascination of how things line up in unexpected ways, how things sort of make sense that once didn't make sense. And there's also a sense in which, learning implies something that is being added on to my treasure chest of learning. But I think a more accurate way in which I actually experience that, it's more like, it's not so much things I've accumulated as much as things that have been revealed. And that to me is what is so endlessly fascinating about training, is that just things become revealed that seem sometimes stunning. So tonight, I titled this talk, The Elegance of Not Enough. And to introduce it, it's going to have sort of three parts to it. But I asked Heather to put up 5 photos that I sent her. And I'm just going to sort of name the photo as it comes up. But I just want to kind of, this is my overview phase of things. But if the photos, I want you to absorb those photos. I don't plan to come back and put them up on the screen again, because I want you to grasp it in its immediacy, and then I want me to bring it alive with what I have to say, and then with, as you have questions or comments at the end, where we go with this. So Heather, can you put up number 1, please? Well, soak that in, everybody. As they say, that's from a book that was translated in English, published in 1967. And you're seeing 5 raw eggs, fresh out of the chicken coop, and they're bundled with lengths of straw. So this is sort of one of the 3 arenas of my fascination over the years, is with Japanese design, or more accurately, Japanese folk design. There was nobody who designed this. This just came out of a tradition where there were farms and there were chickens and there was rice straw, and there was a need to transport eggs without breaking them. We'll come back to that next photo. Let's see what we got. Oh, there you go. Great. That is a picture inside the Zen dojo here in Spring Greene. And we are doing our chanting, our evening chanting, which we call okyo in Japanese. And the light comes from candles. And as I'll describe more later, the reason it comes from candles is that I have a growing, what to call it, sense of the impact of climate crises on all of our lives, that the disruption to our lives is increasing in frequency, it's increasing in degree. I heard something, maybe just myself, so that times of not enough electricity, not enough fuel, not enough heat, not enough food, not enough healthcare, not enough many things, I think is going to be more and more part of all of our lives. So that's sort of a second arena for me, is loss of the expected resources. Okay, and next slide. Next photo. Yeah. Most of you, maybe other than Heather, haven't seen this before. This is the Japanese bath #1. Its first incarnation here in Spring Greene. And what you're looking at is a 100-gallon tank for watering horses. And it's hooked up on the side with a little shiny wood boiler. And you can see the pipes connecting the tank to the boiler. And you fill up the tank and fire up the boiler, and you get just incredibly voluptuous, right up to your chin, your legs are stretched out, very hot bath. And this to me is like the essence of what I call the technology of Zen training. That's the third arena I want to talk about tonight, is this idea that there's a technology to what we do, technology in the sense of solving problems. How do we solve problems in Zen? And two other photos, just to take this into another direction. Here we are with a meal in front of us in a Zen setting, where on the left, I've got a wrapped set of nested bowls, 5 bowls with the chopsticks, the hashi tucked into them. And when those are unwrapped and set before me, sitting at a low table, they become where my food goes for that particular meal. And you'll see more of this in the next photo. And here's those dishes in action. This is from the fall session we just did. And you see Audrey reaching one of her bowls forward to get the closing tea. But then there's also another element to closing tea, which I'll describe when we come back to this. Okay, Heather, thanks. End of slides. So there you go. 3 arenas. The beauty of what I call Japanese folk design, the looming, impending times of disruption to the resources that we use. And then the third arena being this, what I call the technology of Zen training. And when I was sort of mapping out this talk, and I had this circle and this circle and this circle, and then I realized that what is right in the center of all 3 of them is the phrase that I used to title this talk, "The Elegance of Not Enough." Because that's my claim, is that rather than not enough being a limitation, it can be, I'd go so far as to call it a liberation. Or we could say the liberation of not enough. But there's a profound elegance that's available when your resources have been disrupted. So let's come back to Japanese design. And one way I've described this is just I'm quoting from myself. It's talking about Japanese folk design. It's a form of beauty based on pragmatism, use of natural materials, and a minimal use of resources for the task at hand. How do you get the most out of the least? And as you saw with those 5 eggs, a beautiful solution where there's rice straw in abundance, left over from the rice crop, and it's kept for all kinds of purposes. But how few, that was maybe a dozen strands of rice straw that could be quickly shaped in a form that held 5 eggs. And you can almost picture how that was done, where there was 1 egg, there's rice straw was the early knot, they were tied together, then 1 egg was placed on top, and then the straw comes up and you do 1 set of ties for that egg, put on another egg, do another set of ties, 3rd egg, another set of ties. You tie it off at the top, attach a loop for your hand, and off you go. Take it to your neighbor, take it to your market. They're cushioned. They're not going to bump around. And I've been thinking about the sophistication that goes into arriving at that kind of solution, or let's call it, I guess a better phrase is sensitivity. And I was trying to think of when I myself have experienced something like that. I think it was when I was doing my formal live-in monastic training. And in a traditional fashion, all the people who are living there at the same time, you don't have one set role. Instead, the roles rotate, maybe every 3 months or so. So that if you were the gardener for January, February, March, now you become the bookkeeper for April, May, June. And so I was living there, and I got rotated into the position of cook, which which was not a sign of, gee, we really want to taste what Gordon's cooking. It was more like, well, okay, Greene, if you can survive this work, I guess we can survive this work. It was very much sink or swim. There's not much money for groceries. You get sort of necessities out of the grocery store. Supporters of the training dojo would bring by, a sack of rice, or maybe there was a sale of carrots and they'd bring by a couple extra bags of carrots, drop them off. You never really knew what ingredients you would have at hand, and nor did you always know how many people you'd be feeding. Lunch was really the main meal. Breakfast was pretty straightforward. Dinner was leftovers, but lunch was usually the one meal that was done fresh. And there was just, people would come by, people would be away on errands. So there I was. And the other thing that added excitement to that noonday meal was that my teacher would be there to eat, and so would his very traditional Japanese wife be there to eat. I think I said I was in that role for 3 months. And it might have been 10 weeks, but it might have been 12 weeks. that she would come into the kitchen and sit down with everybody. And, the food was there and it was served. We all got show and bow, pick up your chopsticks, pick up your soup or whatever it was, and you're going to eat. She would pick up her food, stand up, walk over to the wastebasket, and dump it in the wastebasket. Scrape it off with her hot chopsticks, put her dishes in the sink, and walk out without saying a word. Let's call it 10 weeks, 70 days, 70 lunches dumped in the wastebasket. In retrospect, I might have asked somebody why, like what's going on? But she did it in such a way, silently, that it was like a resounding judgment that said, this food stinks. I'm not going to eat this. The rest of you guys have to, because that's kind of the deal. I don't have to eat this. I've got a kitchen at home. So I'll keep showing up, but that doesn't mean I have to eat this. Painful. One of the things I'd learned to make early on was tofu patties, where we could get a lot of tofu because we were good. There was a tofu factory just down the road from us that was very supportive of the dojo, so we could have all the tofu we wanted. So that was basically free. And then there was vegetables from the garden that could get chopped up. We could get dried mushrooms occasionally. I'd use an egg or two for binder and make these tofu patties. And one day I made tofu patties. And that was the first day she didn't stand up and dump the food. And I was, again, nothing being said. Like nothing like, wow, that was terrific. But she stuck around and she ate it. And so in reflection, it's like, well, what, it's the same ingredients that I'd used many times, probably made tofu patties once a week. I couldn't sense anything being different from today's work from all the other times when I failed. Except something inside of me wanted to feed her. I wanted her, and I certainly some of that was for my sake, but also just for her sake. I was at least sensitive enough to realize that she didn't really enjoy doing this. She wasn't being malicious or snarky or whatever. She just was expressing what she felt needed to be expressed. So there was a kind of unconscious care that built up in me in terms of how I selected the carrots, how I soaked, rehydrated, cut the mushrooms, how I handled the tofu with my hands, because when you're making tofu patties, there's a certain phase where you've got your hands in the bowl and you're squeezing and you're mixing and you're shaping these patties. So something inside of me had changed to a degree that now she would eat. So and that to me had this feeling of this folk design where all you've got is these few ingredients at hand, but how you handle those materials with what degree of sensitivity and care, do you care about the person actually making it home with their eggs intact? Do you care that there's something about that particular design that sort of conveys freshness? It's like they were just plucked out of the straw where the chickens lay eggs, and it wasn't like they were placed in some other kind of container separate from what the chickens know. It's like, no, the chickens actually, the chickens know that straw. So there's a feeling of caring that sort of woke up in me. I didn't know that the taste of food could be changed by the degree of caring exhibited by the person making the food. I didn't know that. I didn't have language for that. I didn't have articulated experience for that. Nobody told me that as I was growing up. I'm tasting the cook. And yeah, that's what I want to say about sort of the sophistication of Japanese folk design, that it's pragmatic, it's to a given purpose, it's using the least amount of resources possible, but it has an intensity of care that either brings it alive or it doesn't. Okay? There's that part. So now let's talk about this idea of limited resources. So boy, I don't know where all you live. I know you live all over the place. And I'm just guessing if you sort of went back over the last 2 years of your local environment, there's been some kind of extreme. And it might have been sudden, the way a tornado is sudden, or it might have been more gradual, the way a heat wave builds and builds and builds and builds, or forest fires and the way they change air quality dramatically, or the way floods can happen and cause a lot of disruption. So I was here in Wisconsin, we've skated through the past 2 years. I can't point to anything either quick or slow in terms of natural disasters, but that's just the roll of the dice in 2 years' time. It's going to hit here. It's going to hit where you are. It's going to hit with increasing frequency, et cetera. And when it does, as I said earlier, it disrupts the resources that you have at hand. And it's like, as many people do, and we look at this in our individual efforts, our individual lives, what can I do? How can I help? And we feel so limited in what we can do, how we can help. Either the situation that is changing the climate or the people caught up in these disasters. But as we were approaching the fall sesshin, which was our first in-person sesshin in quite a while, I was thinking about overt experiences that we can have here at the Spring Green Dojo that can shift perhaps our thinking from the idea that those disasters, boy, this is a rough one. Is it simply going to be hard times that we are facing, or can it be creative times that we are facing? Can there be something that comes out of a sudden disruption or loss of resources that perhaps is better than it was before? Kind of a very living question for me. And so one way that we handled Sesshin was that I said we won't use electricity in the dojo building. The jiki can have a candle just so that people can not stumble into each other in the dark. But we're not gonna have any electricity for use. And where that sort of would have the biggest impact on our ordinary behavior in the dojo is when we sit down and we read Okyo together. We read the sutras. And there's some that's done early in the morning, and there's some that's done late at night, and that time of year in the fall. Both periods are dark. And there's very few people in our entire community who have all of the Okyos memorized. That takes a very concerted effort, or it takes a monastic condition where you're reading those things twice a day, every day for 10 years. Then you got a fighting chance of having them memorized. But so for the most part, people are reading from their Okyo books, words printed on paper, and there's enough light to read words on paper. But the quality of sound when you do Okyo in that fashion is impaired. It's not the same quality of sound as when you're not reading from something. Instead, you're just simply using your breath, using your body, using your voice, using a unified sense of resonance in the room, that the sound shifts dramatically. And we to date, we rarely do that, where we don't have the majority of people reading words on a paper. So this time it's like, okay, lights are off. You can't read. There's just not enough light. So we'll have two leaders, one person on the bells and one person on the mokugyo, which is a wooden drum that starts the beat. Boom, 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 boom. We'll have them rigged out with like a headlamp so that they at least can set the base for everybody. But everybody else, win or lose, you've got to find a way to now join in this sound. Otherwise, you're going to be incredibly bored for 30 minutes just sitting there on your cushion, not doing anything while the chanting's going on. And it was a remarkable experience that people were able to feel their way into the sound even when they didn't know the Okyo. They could find sort of like the bass note. Every Okyo has a bass note to it. And if you find that bass note, you can start to join in the Namo Samanda Moto Nano Harachi. It's not so hard. And so suddenly, we had that room reverberating in ways that I hadn't heard before. And it came about because we deliberately cut one of the resources. That was a success. I can describe a failure. This one due to COVID. We really wanted Thanksgiving dinner together with my son, two of my sons, and Alex's new wife, Vanessa. And she was pregnant, a lot of concerns about the virus, optimizing safety. You know what? As much as we want to be together inside, we can't. So it's like, okay, we'll eat outside. And so we set up a big table outside and we covered it with a cloth and we put an electric heater under it. And we set up another windbreak so that the breeze wouldn't come ripping by through us. And we put a fire in the bread oven so that at least if you couldn't feel the heat very well from the bread oven, at least you could see it. It's sort of psychologically, it's like, oh yeah, there's fire over there. So we were dealing with constraints. We can't eat inside. We can't have normal temperatures with which we sit down to a gorgeous Thanksgiving feast. And I would not call it a success. It was so cold, despite all the things that we had done. Cold gravy, it just doesn't do things for me the way warm gravy does. So that was a deliberate attempt, with reduced, limited resources, to do something that we really longed to do, with a lot of care. A lot of care went into that food, but it didn't work. But this idea of how do we find what can be great when resources are limited continues for me. This is something I really want to figure out, because I know these times are coming, and as hard as they will be, I want to be finding ways that we can creatively ride the wave, whatever it is, and however it is that it comes. So I'm just going to do a time check here. Okay. So that brings me to the technology of Zen training. And by that, as I said, I want to talk about how do we solve problems. So when I was preparing this talk, I did a talk for a tech group in San Francisco several years ago. It was sort of an audacious attempt to take I see Jim smiling. Yeah. Yep. I deliberately walked into this crowd of silicon geek heads saying that there's a technology to Zen training, and I want you to understand what it is and see if you can help me make it better. That was the goal. And so I had to do a lot of background reading on sort of how do engineers think about problems. And in a very simplistic way, that there's sort of three questions that you have to answer if you're going to be developing a piece of technology. And one question is, well, what's the problem that you're trying to address or solve? That's considered, in some ways, the hardest step. Knowing what your problem actually is in language that's actionable is not easy. That's one step. Once you've got a sense of that, then you sort of pull out your toolkit and ask yourself, okay, what tools in my repertoire or in anybody's repertoire can we bring to bear in addressing this problem? Now, the third step is, how will we know if we've actually addressed it? How do we know if we successfully have solved this problem? Because you might think you named the problem and addressed the problem, but where's the proof? How do you know? So those are three elements. And I also learned that that many times in solving problems in this wonderful analytic fashion is that they consider levels of problems. That there's a level 1 problem and a level 2 problem and a level 3 problem, with the level 1 being the most generalized version, and then underneath that general problem, there's a subset of problems that are the number twos. And under that, another set of subset, which would be the level three. So as an example, for Zen, in our world, a level one problem is that human beings are dualistic. They live in a framework of me or you, right and wrong, life and death. That's a problem. And we know it's a problem because it causes a lot of suffering. So a level two problem is it's hard to address that. It's hard to find ways for people to break through that dualistic conception of themselves in the world. And so because it's hard, you have to find ways of putting people together over periods of time, whether it's online, in a monastic setting, somewhere where they are working together to resolve the problem number one. So how to put people together, sort of the method of addressing duality. In our case, it's the Zen training that we do, the group Zazen that we do. But because you're doing that over time, a subset of that level of problem is just, well, you got to get people fed and you got to get people bathed. And how do you do that? How do you do those kind of things in a way that doesn't disrupt what you're doing with your Zazen, which is the level two, which is an attempt to resolve duality, which is level one? So I've been looking over the years at a lot of our techniques, our methods, and looking at them as a technology meant to solve a problem. So I started out with the photograph of our very first ofudo, is the Japanese word for a Japanese bath set up in that fashion. And here the problem is that you've got, let's say you've got 20 people training for a long weekend, and you've got limited amounts of water available, and you've got limited amounts of firewood available, and you've got limited amounts of time available. 20 people taking a shower, 20 people taking a regular bath, one after the other, that's going to chew up a lot of time in your schedule. Not willing to do that. So what do? You heat up, that's a 100-gallon tank, so you heat up maybe 90 gallons of water, very hot, and then you get people sort of lined up in sequence, and you say, okay, you're gonna go take a bath, and you're going to get 3 bucketfuls of water that you scoop out of that bath while you stand outside that bath, and that's going to be how you bathe. And the first bucket is to get yourself wet all over. The second bucket is for using the soap and getting yourself soaped up all over. And the third bucket is for rinsing that all off. And you got to rinse it all off so thoroughly that you can then step into that bath, that 90 gallons of hot water, minus your 3 buckets, without any soap suds, without any, crud between your toes. And now you've got a place where you can soak for a few minutes up to your chin, muscles, bones, joints that ache after many, many hours of Zazen. And you can do it. You can put 20 people through that bath in an hour. We've done it. I even had one woman with very, very long blonde hair who decided her challenge was to see if she could do all that plus wash her hair in 3 buckets. And I was only seeing it after the fact, but it looked like she did it. Now compare that to how we normally take a bath, take a shower. You know, if you go to I forget, it was like the American Bathing Institute. I don't know if that was it, but let's just pretend there's an American Bathing Institute. And they're from all their analysis, they concluded that the average American uses 17.2 gallons of hot water for a shower. And that they're in there for something like 10.3 minutes. So men, women, young, old, average it all together, 17.2 gallons over 10.2 minutes. So for 20 people, that comes out to roughly 344 gallons of hot water. And that would come out to whatever that be, 10 point, that's more than 100, 200, over 200 minutes, so which is over 3 hours if you just did it the regular fashion, one by one by one by one by one. So somehow we've taken something that we're all used to doing kind of on our own with the hot water that we want and with the time that we want. And you're saying, no, that's not the deal. That's not what you're going to get here. You're going to do it quickly. You're going to do it very attentively. But the payoff is that you get this soak. And many times when people are here, I will deliberately be the last person in the bath because I want to know how much water is left in that tank after there's been 20 people scooping out 3 buckets. And it seems like it's about 2/3 full. It's not bad. I still can get a reasonable soak out of that tub. So it solves the problem of bathing and soothing aching bones and joints and muscles in what I consider a very, very efficient fashion. And with a little bit of work, I could tell you how many pounds of firewood we used and how much CO2 was released in that firing, and the impact on our well water, et cetera. But to me, that represents a very sort of, I'll call it a high technology because of its elegance, not because of its sophistication. There were no computer chips involved in making that bath. There actually was no electricity used in making that bath other than the pump on the well. That water circulates between the boiler and the horse tank. It's a thermosiphon. It does it just because hot water rises and cold water sinks. And it takes about an hour and a half to get that fired up. And it's actually just as I was describing my time in the kitchen and the frustrations of cooking around here, we consider it a very high art to be the bath firer because you've got limited wood, limited time, and how to get the temperature. There's like about a 3-degree window for the right temperature. If it's too hot, people can't get in the tank. If it's too cold, it doesn't resolve the aches in the muscles. And there's been some pretty hilarious scenes where I've seen guys sort of they want to get in a tank. It's very hot. So they got their feet on the rim and then they're reaching back with their hands and they got their hands in the rim and they're sort of lowering themselves down to see if their butt can withstand the temperature of the water and deciding that it can't, but they don't want to give up. So they're sort of in this suspended animation over this very hot bath pissed as hell that it's too hot. And the next person is waiting to take a bath. So it's like, okay, well, yeah, what the hell was that? So to get the bath right is a very high level of skill, like making those tofu patties. How are we doing for time? Wow, it's going by. The other thing I want to reference is very quickly is I showed you how we eat together in a traditional fashion, where we've got, our own bowls, and we arrive at our setting and we unwrap our bowls and we lay out the number of bowls that will take the food for that meal's menu. A simple meal, you might use 3 bowls. A dinner, you might use 5 bowls. But then I showed you how at the end, you've eaten all your food and you have tea that's served. But then the really elegant thing is that there's one more serving of tea, which now becomes your dishwashing water. And you are pouring that hot water from bowl to bowl, and as it goes in each bowl, you've saved behind one round, flat. It can be a sliced daikon kind of pickle. There's other kinds of pickle that carry the same thing, but you take that and you scrape it around your bowl till your bowl is completely clean, and then you dump that water into the next bowl and do the same thing, all 5 bowls, and then you drink it. And that's your finishing tea. And then you've got a napkin that you use and you dry off your bowls. And again, there's great feedback for whether you're doing that well or not, because let's say it's summertime and it's a 6-day session and it's 85, 86, 90 degree heat. And for whatever reason, you decide, yeah, okay, that's clean enough. Whereas in reality, there's still some food scrap in your bowl or on your napkin. And after 3 or 4 or 5 days, that remnant food is going to start talking to you. And you don't get a fresh set of bowls and you don't get a fresh napkin. It's like, I don't care what's growing there. Here's your food, and that's where it's going. So what I wanted to point out is that the issues with food and food serving that you're dealing with is that there's a finite amount of food that's been prepared. It's the cook's judgment. How much food does this crowd need for this meal, in this conditions, in this weather? But everybody's not the same. There's different levels of appetite. You got a young guy who wants, great chunks, and you got somebody who's much more delicate and refined. They just want a little bit. How do you deal with that? There's no storage available for leftovers. So if you don't make enough food, people are hungry. If you make too much food, well, sorry, folks, we all got to share the excess here and eat it up, because we're not going to throw it out and we can't store it. There is limited hot water and there is limited labor for washing dishes. So I'm not taking all those dirty dishes to the kitchen and washing them and then giving them back to you clean. I know you want to drink some tea. Well, you know what? I'll give you one serving of a sort of official tea, but then I'm going to give you a second tea that you make out of whatever's left over in your bowl. There you go. You got your tea. I've fed you something, but in the meantime, you've ended up with clean bowls, and you keep them with you the whole time. There's no shuffling around of bowls going in and out of the kitchen. They stay with you. But then there's also just obviously the question of nutrition. You got people kind of busting ass during session, And some of it's the hard work of sitting on a cushion, and some of it's the hard work of manual labor outdoors. And your body is in sort of, you're not getting as much sleep as you're used to. And you sometimes have different levels of anxiety, so the kind of food that nourishes somebody during sesshin is very, very refined in terms of what it's meant to do and how it's meant to do it. And I haven't even talked about sort of the rhythm of how food is served. I would need sort of an animation of us showing you the tables laid out and people sitting, and here comes the servers, and they do this, and then they go here, and they do there. But then while this is happening, this is happening. It's a very elegant dance. It starts together, it ends together. And it includes the young guy who wants to wolf down 3 bowls of soup, and the wonderful person who just only needs a sniff from a half a bowl of soup. Somehow the timing for everybody has to end at the same. So I have exhausted my time. I've hardly left time for questions. I've been excited because I love thinking about this stuff.
We can go to 8:45, so we still have.
Well, that's good. Yeah, that's right. I forgot. Okay, so then I'll stop. What do you guys got? What questions, comments? When I say the elegance of not enough, or when I say the technology of Zen training, what does that make you wonder about? What does that make you think about? What have you experienced in that kind of framing